The first time someone laughed at my cane, I let it go. The second time they fined me $750 because my truck tire crossed a painted line by barely 2 inches, I realized it was never about parking, it was about power, and what happened after that changed an entire neighborhood in ways nobody saw coming. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 53 years old, retired from the Army after 28 years of service, and I live in a quiet subdivision outside Ashford, Maryland, the kind of place where people wave at each other while walking their dogs in the morning and spend the rest of the day arguing in Facebook groups about mailbox colors and holiday decorations. When I bought my grandfather's old house 4 years ago, I honestly believed I'd found the perfect place to slow life down. The house wasn't fancy, just a solid brick ranch with a wraparound porch and 2 maple trees my grandfather planted when my mother was a little girl. Every board in that house carried a memory. Every scratch in the hardwood floor reminded me of family dinners, Christmas mornings, and summers that seemed to last forever. After everything I'd seen overseas, that little place felt like peace. My knee wasn't what it used to be after an explosion outside Kandahar years ago, so I walked with a carbon fiber cane most days. Some mornings it barely bothered me. Other mornings, every step reminded me exactly how old injuries never really disappear. They just learn how to hide until the weather changes. Every month, I drove over to the VA hospital for appointments, physical therapy, and paperwork that somehow never seemed to end. It wasn't exciting, but it was my routine, and routines become comforting when you've spent half your life living where tomorrow was never guaranteed. The neighborhood had an HOA, of course. I'd dealt with military regulations my entire career, so a few neighborhood rules didn't seem like a big deal. Keep your lawn trimmed, don't leave trash cans out all week, repaint your fence if it starts peeling. Reasonable enough. At first, I barely noticed the board members. They seemed more interested in measuring hedges than actually talking to people. Then, 6 months after I moved in, a new HOA president was elected. Her name was Linda Carver. Mid-50s, always dressed like she was headed to a country club luncheon, clipboard tucked under one arm, sunglasses perched on her head, even when the sky was cloudy. She had a smile that somehow managed to make people uncomfortable, the kind that never reached her eyes. Folks started joking that Linda didn't walk the neighborhood. She patrolled it. Every Saturday morning, she'd cruise around in her white SUV, looking for violations, as if she were collecting trophies. At first, she ignored me. Then one afternoon, she stopped while I was carrying groceries inside. She watched me lean on my cane before saying, "You know, your flower beds could really use some attention." I smiled politely and thanked her for the suggestion. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, I received a warning because one of my shrubs was supposedly an inch taller than HOA guidelines. 2 weeks after that, it was my trash can, even though I'd brought it in before dinner. Then it was the color of my front porch light. Little things, always little things. Nothing expensive, just enough to let me know somebody was paying very close attention. My neighbor across the street, an older widower named Frank, noticed it too. One evening while we were sitting on our porches watching kids ride bicycles, he chuckled and said, "Danny, I think Linda's made your favorite hobby." I laughed with him, but deep down I knew he was right. The morning everything changed started like any other. I left home before sunrise for another VA appointment, spent nearly 4 hours between doctors, paperwork, and physical therapy, then grabbed a sandwich on the drive back. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my knee was throbbing so badly, I just wanted to get inside, take off my brace, and sit in my recliner with a cup of coffee. Instead, I found a bright orange envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was a violation notice. $750 because the rear tire of my pickup extended beyond the painted parking boundary by approximately 2 inches. Attached to that was another notice demanding I repaint the exterior trim of my home within 14 days at my own expense or face additional penalties totaling $3,200. I actually laughed at first because I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Then I looked closer and realized Linda herself had signed both citations. I called the number listed at the bottom of the page. She answered after 2 rings. "Linda's speaking." I kept my voice calm. "Hi, this is Daniel Mercer on Willow Ridge Drive. I just got home from the VA and found these notices. I think there's been some misunderstanding. My truck was only slightly over the line, and I have a disability placard. My appointments sometimes make getting in and out of the vehicle a little difficult. She didn't let me finish. Mr. Mercer, rules are rules. They apply to everyone. I took a slow breath. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking for a little common sense. There was a pause. Then she laughed softly, the kind of laugh that wasn't amused, just dismissive. Maybe if you'd spent less time pretending to be some hero and more time learning how neighborhoods actually function, you wouldn't have these problems. I stared at the phone, wondering if I'd heard her correctly. Before I could answer, she added one more sentence that sat heavier than the fine itself. That cane doesn't excuse you from following the rules. Then she hung up. I stood there in my driveway for nearly a full minute. The afternoon breeze moving through the maple trees while kids laughed somewhere down the block. I wasn't shaking because I was angry. I learned a long time ago that anger clouds judgment. What I felt was something much quieter, clarity. I walked into my garage, ignored the violation notices sitting on my workbench, and headed for a dusty metal filing cabinet my grandfather had owned longer than I'd been alive. There were old deeds, faded surveys, tax receipts, handwritten letters tied together with twine, pieces of family history most people would have thrown away decades earlier. As I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a weathered leather folder with my grandfather's handwriting across the front, I had no idea that buried inside those yellowed pages was a forgotten piece of property that every single family in our neighborhood depended on. And by the time Linda Carver realized what she had awakened, it would already be far too late. I carried the leather folder over to my workbench, brushed away a layer of dust, and opened it carefully because the paper inside looked older than I was. My grandfather had never thrown anything away. As a kid, I thought he was just stubborn. As an adult, I realized he simply understood that memories fade, but paperwork has a funny way of surviving long enough to settle arguments. There were faded tax receipts from the 1950s, handwritten correspondence with the county, survey sketches drawn with a fountain pen, and finally a folded plat map that still held its crisp blue survey lines despite its age. Right beside it sat a warranty deed with one sentence circled in red pencil by my grandfather decades earlier. Grantor expressly retains ownership of the private access roadway identified as Parcel C. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. People think discoveries like that make you excited. They don't. They make you careful. I spent too many years in the Army making decisions based on assumptions. Assumptions get people hurt. Facts keep people alive. The next morning, I drove downtown instead of answering Linda's violation notice. My first stop was a surveyor named Brian Ellis, an older man who'd spent 40 years untangling property disputes. He studied the documents for nearly an hour without saying much. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and asked, "Where did you get these?" "My grandfather's files." He smiled. Good thing he never liked throwing things away. 2 days later, Brian met me at the entrance to our subdivision. He compared the original plat against modern GIS records, paced the property with GPS equipment, and quietly whistled under his breath. "Daniel, unless I'm missing something, this roadway was never legally dedicated to the county, and I can't find a recorded easement benefiting the subdivision." I didn't answer. I simply asked the question that mattered. "Can you prove it?" He nodded. "Oh, I can prove it." My second appointment was with a real estate attorney named Rebecca Sloan. She specialized in title issues, the kind most people never think about until millions of dollars suddenly depend on them. She spent nearly 3 hours researching old records while I waited outside her office, drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine. When she finally called me back in, she placed 3 printed documents across her desk. "I've checked everything twice," she said. "The developer who expanded this subdivision in the late 80s clearly assumed the roadway, transferred with the surrounding property. Apparently nobody ever verified the chain of title." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning if these records are authentic, ownership stayed with your family the entire time." I let that sink in. So 47 homes have been using my road for decades. Rebecca corrected me immediately. "Not exactly your road. Your family's road, and now yours." She paused before adding something that changed the way I looked at the situation. "Daniel, Ownership gives you rights, but rights come with responsibilities. Whatever you do next needs to be measured, reasonable, and legally defensible. Don't make this personal. I smiled faintly. Trust me, if this were personal, I'd already be making bad decisions. Over the next week, we built a paper trail instead of a confrontation. Brian completed a modern survey. Rebecca drafted legal notices. I visited the county recorder's office twice to obtain certified copies of every document connected to Parcel C. Every office I walked into told the same story. Someone decades ago had assumed everything was fine because no one had ever questioned it. That assumption had quietly become accepted truth. Meanwhile, Linda continued sending notices. My mailbox collected one warning after another. Grass height. A garden hose left visible beside the garage. A flower pot she claimed wasn't approved. Frank wandered over one evening carrying 2 iced teas and laughed when he saw another envelope taped to my front door. She really wants you gone, doesn't she? I shrugged. No, she wants me to submit. He stared at me for a second before grinning. That's a dangerous difference. Rebecca eventually approved the final draft of the certified letters. They weren't threatening. They didn't contain dramatic language. In fact, they were surprisingly polite. Each homeowner received the same explanation. The access road entering the subdivision remained privately owned. Historic documentation confirmed no recorded easement existed. Continued use would require negotiating a formal access agreement. Rebecca insisted on one important point. We're not locking anyone out overnight. Give everyone reasonable notice. Courts appreciate reasonableness. So that's exactly what we did. Every letter included 30 days before any changes would take effect. It also included 2 options. The first was simple. The Homeowners Association could negotiate a community access agreement funded collectively at a fixed monthly rate that would cover maintenance, insurance, taxes, and long-term preservation of the roadway. The second option was equally simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. The subdivision could construct an entirely new entrance across neighboring lowlands, a project engineers estimated would cost well over $1 million before environmental permitting even began. I didn't choose those numbers. Independent engineers did. Rebecca mailed every letter by certified mail. Then we waited. Waiting, it turns out, is harder than fighting. 3 days later, my phone exploded with calls from confused neighbors. Some were angry. Others genuinely wanted to understand. A young couple named Eric and Melissa knocked on my door, carrying copies of the notice. Please tell us this is some kind of misunderstanding, Melissa said. I invited them inside, spread the old deeds across my dining room table, and walked them through every document. Eric looked back and forth between the survey and the county records before muttering. So, nobody ever checked? Apparently not. Melissa sighed. Then why didn't the HOA know? I smiled without much humor. Maybe because they spent more time measuring lawns than reading title records. Word spread fast. By Friday evening, the clubhouse parking lot was packed for an emergency HOA meeting. I didn't attend. Rebecca specifically advised against it. Let them have their meeting. Don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Facts don't become stronger because you repeat them louder. Around 8 that night, Frank texted me a single sentence. She's losing the room. The following morning, Linda showed up at my driveway with 2 board members and a man I assumed was the association's attorney. She stepped out of her SUV wearing the same confident expression I'd seen dozens of times before. Mr. Mercer, she announced loudly, we're here because you've created unnecessary panic. I leaned against my porch railing. Morning, Linda. She held up my letter. This ridiculous claim that you own the entrance road is causing serious concern. It's not a claim. I answer calmly. It's a documented property interest. The attorney asked politely if he could review my copies. I handed him the survey, the chain of title, and Rebecca's legal opinion. He spent nearly 10 minutes reading without speaking. Linda finally interrupted. Well, the attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at her. Where are your easement records? The developer built the neighborhood. That's not what I asked. Her confidence started slipping. Surely they're somewhere. He closed the folder slowly. If they're somewhere, they aren't recorded. Nobody said a word for several seconds. Even the birds seemed quieter. Linda finally turned toward me, forcing another smile that looked thinner than before. "We'll sort this out." I nodded. "I'm sure you will." As they walked back toward their vehicles, the attorney stayed behind for just a moment. In a voice only I could hear, he said, "Mr. Mercer, whatever happens next, don't lose your patience. You're in a much stronger position if you remain the calmest person in the conversation." I watched them drive away, then looked toward the entrance of a subdivision where every car entering or leaving passed across the same stretch of asphalt people had ignored for nearly 40 years. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't arguing about my lawn or my truck. They were asking a question nobody had ever imagined needing to ask: who actually owned the road beneath their wheels? The next 2 weeks felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Rebecca and I never rushed anything. Every conversation stayed professional. Every document was filed properly. Every deadline was reasonable. That turned out to matter more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Once the association's attorney completed his own title search, the tone changed overnight. The violation notices stopped. The emails stopped. Even Linda stopped driving past my house every Saturday morning. Instead, homeowners started knocking on my door one at a time. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Others admitted they had never liked the way the board treated people, but were afraid to speak up. Frank laughed when he saw the line of neighbors waiting on my porch one afternoon. "Funny," he said, "people finally discovered your address after all these years." I smiled. Better late than never. Behind closed doors, things were falling apart for the board. Their attorney explained that fighting the title issue would likely cost a fortune with almost no chance of success unless they could somehow produce an easement that decades of public records had failed to reveal. At the same time, several pending home sales stalled because buyers wanted clarification about permanent legal access. Suddenly, the issue Linda had dismissed as nonsense became the only topic anyone cared about. About 3 weeks after my first certified letter went out, Rebecca received a call asking if I would attend a mediation session. I agreed on one condition. Everything would be recorded in writing, and every homeowner would receive the same information afterward. The meeting lasted almost 5 hours. There were moments when voices rose, moments when accusations flew across the conference table. But every time someone tried to make it personal, Rebecca calmly slid another document across the table and brought the conversation back to facts. Eventually, the numbers spoke louder than emotions. A negotiated long-term access agreement would cost everyone far less than years of litigation, declining property values, engineering studies for a second entrance, and endless uncertainty. One by one, even the board members stopped arguing. Linda remained silent for most of the final hour. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded very different from the one I'd heard on the phone weeks earlier. "Mr. Mercer," she began, then paused before correcting herself. "Daniel, I handled this badly." The room stayed quiet. She took a slow breath. I focused so much on enforcing rules that I forgot there were actual people living behind those front doors. It wasn't a perfect apology. Maybe it never could be, but it was honest enough for me. I looked around the room at neighbors who had nothing to do with the way this started. Families raising kids. Retired couples enjoying quiet mornings. Young homeowners trying to build their future. They were my enemies. They had simply trusted the wrong leadership. So I made a proposal of my own. We finalized a 25-year recorded easement with a fixed annual maintenance payment instead of endless disputes. Every previous fine issued against my property was permanently withdrawn. The association agreed to reimburse my legal expenses, and the board adopted a new review policy requiring hardship considerations before penalties could ever be issued again. More importantly, the agreement guaranteed permanent emergency access protected by law, so no family would ever have to worry about uncertainty again. Before everyone left, Linda stood up one last time and quietly said, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about what I said regarding your service and your cane." I looked down at the carbon fiber cane resting beside my chair, smiled a little. "This thing reminds me every day of what I lost," I told her, but it also reminds me what I came home with. Perspective. A month later, life looked almost exactly the way it had before. Kids still rode bicycles down the street. Frank still waved from his porch every evening. The maple trees still drop too many leaves every fall. The only real difference was that people actually stopped to talk to one another instead of looking for reasons to complain. Sometimes I'd sit on my front porch with a cup of coffee and watch cars roll quietly across the entrance road my grandfather had protected all those years without ever imagining why it might matter someday. He used to tell me, "Son, land isn't valuable because you can stand on it. It's valuable because someday somebody will need it." Back then I thought he was talking about money. Now I know he was talking about responsibility. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever about a road, a fine, or even an HOA. It was about what happens when authority forgets compassion and when ordinary people underestimate the quiet strength of someone they've already decided to dismiss. I'm curious where you stand. If you were in my shoes, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have made a different choice? Let me know in the comments, because these conversations are rarely as simple as they first appear. And if you enjoy stories about property rights, neighborhood conflicts, and unexpected twists where patience wins over pride, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.